and they focus on being engaging no matter how you decide to play the game. If you're going for special stages, A ranks, or just trying to get to the end, there's a lot of challenge and creativity on offer. From the rush of speeding through Grand Metropolis and Power Plant, to the bounciness and danger in the casino levels, especially Bingo Highway and its bingo minigame as you slide down the board. Then there's the death-defying rail grinding of Rail Canyon and Bullet Station, the whimsical rush through the ever-changing flora and fauna of Frog Forest and Lost Jungle, the various tricks and puzzles that await you in Hang Castle and Mystic Mansion, and finally the sense of scale and danger as you traverse the dizzying heights and limitless alternate paths of Egg Fleet and Final Fortress. I love pretty much all of these levels, but there are a few things that can make them annoying to play. Sonic Heroes revolves around the team mechanic. Despite the game having 12 playable characters, there's only one gameplay style between all of them. In each team, you control speed, flight, and power characters, and you can switch between these three types at any time. Each character has their own specific uses, and when you're moving this fast, it can be satisfying to apply them in a series of high-speed puzzles. As you level each character up from 1 to 3, they can accomplish more. For example, Knuckles' default punching combo can end in a giant explosion. Sonic can kill most enemies on his own with a single homing attack, and it becomes so powerful that it can take the place of his tornado attack. Tails' Thunder Shoot breaks the game in half as soon as he hits level 2, which makes him my preferred character for taking out flying enemies and groups of egg pawns. Even with enemies sporting health bars, for the most part, intelligent use of your abilities and strategic use of the screen-nuking Team Blast can help you clear them out as fast as possible. This is what makes Sonic Heroes' core gameplay so satisfying to me. It puts a unique spin on the high-speed gameplay I've come to enjoy by introducing problem-solving that moves just as fast. When it works, it comes close to being my favorite 3D Sonic game. But that's the thing, it isn't always the best it can be. Although I love most of the level concepts, there is some repetition of certain design elements that bog down the whole experience. Certain areas of each level are repeated throughout to simulate depth, and when the game asks you to repeatedly slow to a crawl to defeat enemies, the game starts to drag, especially during the last few levels. Apparently only 2 people at Sonic Team were designing levels, Iizuka himself and one other person. Considering only 2 people were responsible for the levels, this is impressive, but you can see the inevitable cracks in their work from time to time. When it comes to combat, the boss fights are pitiful once again. Mash the A button or spam Thunder Shoot, take your pick. I especially hate being locked in with a seemingly endless assortment of bad guys, because it exposes the holes in the rock-paper-scissors combat of Sonic Heroes. A lot of the game hinges on it, and circumstances like this just exacerbate the issues people have with this system. On top of all of that, the controls in Sonic Heroes are ridiculously sensitive and slippery. They move like they're wearing shoes made of butter at high speeds, and your top speed is blisteringly fast in this game. So as you can imagine, this can make for a deadly combination. I mean, you can get used to them, but I still fall to my death as a result of the imprecise controls of Sonic Heroes. I can understand that going multi-platform meant they had to switch to a new engine, but I'm surprised by how much of the groundwork they cast aside. Sonic Adventure's controls were part of the reason the game was so much fun to play and experiment with. Why do away with them? You can't even spin dash in this game. You have to perform a rocket accel, which is finicky at best and unreliable at worst. With that said, nothing compares to the awful structural flaws that Sonic Heroes contains. You might be wondering what the heck I'm even talking about because I mentioned the game moves from stage to stage like the Genesis games. Well, it does. But here's the caveat. You can play as 4 teams: Team Sonic, Team Dark, Team Rose, and Team Chaotix. They all have their slight gameplay differences, but you can think of them as the difficulty select of this game, kind of like Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Team Dark goes through more of any given stage and they encounter more enemies, Team Rose goes through less of a stage and encounters less enemies, and Team Chaotix is one of the worst things ever. But because they go through the same stages, certainly you can treat it like a difficulty select and you won't have to play through every single team to unlock a last story segment, right? Surely they've learned from Sonic Adventure, right?
Oh no!
Playing the game like this just makes the issues I've mentioned even more apparent. And because the game mandates Team Chaotix, I'll explain why they're awful. In each level, you have to go out of your way to find a specific amount of things, or kill a specific amount of enemies. If you miss one, you have to take the teleporter at the end of the level and start all over again. This meticulous design goes against the flow of both Sonic Heroes and a Sonic game altogether, and destroys the pacing of the game entirely. If they were attempting to structure the game like the adventure games, all they really did was ruin what would have otherwise be a decent attempt at replayability. I mean, why not make these teams optional? You beat the game once, come back to it later, and try another team. And on that note, why even have A ranks and emblems anymore? Not only are you playing the game 4 times over to reach the ending, but you also have to play each level again with slightly different win conditions. So in total, that's 8 playthroughs of the same game for true 100%. I like Sonic Heroes' gameplay, but not that much. This is just shameless padding. I admire a lot of Sonic Heroes' concepts, but the game feels botched. I can at least recommend you try out a single playthrough of the game, and I'd recommend that you stay the hell away from Team Chaotix, but I shouldn't be recommending portions of a game, or that you play the game in a specific way to maximize enjoyment. I should be able to recommend all of it. All 3D Sonic games up to this point have had this issue. I shouldn't have to be selective about which parts I am compelled to experience. This series makes me feel insane for enjoying it. In any case, Sonic Heroes was certainly a distinct take on the Sonic formula, but its central mechanic was merely a gimmick that wouldn't exactly inform the future of the series, despite the fun you can have with it. So now the question was, what next? Well, alright then. Although Sonic Heroes' story is simple for the most part, you might have noticed that Shadow is inexplicably alive after his plummet to Earth in SA2. He suffers from amnesia, and either the other characters never feel the need to tell him about his past, or Shadow feels he needs to discover it for himself. Whatever the reason, we received a full game exploring Shadow's mysterious origins. Except not really, because it's a choose-your-own-adventure. Hero or Dark, you decide. Depending on your choices, plot points can be dropped completely, while others appear with no explanation. I suppose they wanted players to piece it together through the various routes, but that just makes understanding whatever truth the story is trying to convey even more convoluted, not to mention utterly ridiculous. The hilarious part? The last story cancels out the entire concept of the game, essentially being the only canon ending. Even if that weren't the case, the story goes all over the place depending on your choices. You can take the true hero path up until the very end, and then switch to Black Doom's side just to screw Sonic over. Plot points with the Gun Commander, Maria, and Eggman will be dropped completely if your route diverges. You can disobey Black Doom altogether, and yet he'll still follow you around as if nothing happened. It's an incoherent, awful mess of disjointed plot lines and laughable storytelling. Although it does have this line,
"This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me."
You can consider Shadow the Hedgehog the game that jumped the shark. Characters are cursing in an attempt to make the game edgier, Shadow is shooting people, there are aliens, the visuals are a grim mix of dark colors. This game is hardcore, isn't it? Well, when you look past its rough exterior and cringeworthy presentation, you'll find one of the most inexcusably boring and repetitive Sonic games ever conceived. The entire game's structure revolves around Team Chaotix's Collectathon gameplay. This means killing a certain amount of enemies, activating a certain amount of MacGuffins, and teleporting around the level to see if you missed a single enemy. Some missions just require you to get to the goal ring, but these are rare. Usually you're exhaustively checking every corner of the level and slowly tapping the analog stick so that you don't miss anything. When just running through to the end of the stage and shooting everything in sight, the core gameplay is passable, and I do get a kick out of the infinite ammo during Chaos Blast, but it's a mindless, miserable excuse for a 3D Sonic game. And in order to reach the last story segment, you have to fight all 10 bosses on the level chart. You have to play this game 10 times over. Shadow the Hedgehog contributes virtually nothing to the Sonic formula or the discussion of 3D Sonic in general. It innovates on little. A ranks are essentially a worthless endeavor as the game is already repetitive enough, and it's a complete waste of Shadow as a character. This game clouded my perception of him, and to this day I question why I loved Shadow as a kid, because all I can think of when I imagine him now is Edgy the Hedgy with a gun and a motorcycle. Though, things couldn't get any worse, right? I'll skip the dramatics. This game is bad, but conceptually it strove to be the best attempt at what we've come to understand as the 3D Sonic formula. There are genuinely great ideas beneath this game's rough exterior. Were they executed well? Not really, but I'll give credit where credit is due. In Sonic 06 there are 3 campaigns, Sonic, Shadow, and Silver. Although Silver's gameplay is an outlier for reasons I'll discuss, basing the majority of each campaign's primary characters around Sonic's gameplay was a smart move. It's what the Sega Genesis games did, and they seem to have something going here with Sonic and Shadow having their differences. In addition, the multiple playable characters are strewn about each campaign to break up the pace of gameplay, rather than having full levels or unnecessary campaigns devoted to them. This is much appreciated, but are the characters fun? Throughout Sonic's campaign, you play as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, with a brief and jarring cameo appearance from Silver. Despite Sonic's top speed being severely nerfed, Sonic's controls are still even more sensitive than Sonic Heroes, and Sonic himself doesn't feel nearly as satisfying to play as. It seems like a single tap of the analog stick can send Sonic running off to another planet. It has this artificial sense of fluidity, whereas the Dreamcast and GameCube games gave actual momentum and weight to Sonic when you attempted to steer his jumps and top speeds. He would slow down on inclines and speed up when moving downhill. Here, not only does Sonic seemingly run at the same speed no matter what the terrain looks like, he'll also magnetize to virtually any walkable surface. Case in point, the snowboarding sequence in White Acropolis. You can actually move uphill at the same speed you would accrue moving downhill, as if Sonic is riding a jet-powered snowboard. On top of this, the game is designed to automate a lot of things. Homing attack chains, loops, dash panels, rails. So many moments in this game's level design play themselves, as long as you know how to hold forward and press the A button wherever necessary. Wave Ocean has multiple egregious examples of this. Remember the whale in Sonic Adventure? Imagine scripted sequences like that, but repeated several times over with very little input from the player. Granted, this isn't the norm for level design, and I'll talk about the positives soon. I just need to vent first. Levels also like to focus on combat in the same vein as Sonic Heroes or Shadow the Hedgehog, which sheds light on just how much slower and monotonous the homing attack is in this game. Rather than being able to quickly go from target to target, they implemented this delay between attacks that grinds the pace of combat to a halt. You're better off just spamming the bounce bracelet when you're on foot. Some of Sonic's abilities have unnecessary restrictions placed on them. Ever since the original Sonic Adventure, we've been able to witness the degradation of the spin dash. It went from being one of the most powerful tools in Sonic's kit, to having a somersault as a secondary option, to a finicky Rocket Excel move, to barely having a focus at all, and now in Sonic 06, you can only perform it while standing still, and you can't jump out of it. One of the most liberating tricks you could perform in the adventure games is now non-existent. The game relies heavily on scripting, combat, and specific design elements to generate thrills, rather than player ingenuity. A problem that began with Sonic Adventure noticeably seeped into this game, and it would continue to plague the design of later games. Sonic also has alternate playstyles of his own. The sections where he's carrying Princess Elise restrict your movement to just the homing attack and a shield. And despite some cool set pieces, the levels are just less interesting to me because of Sonic's limited moveset. The snowboarding segments are... oh dear god, what do they do to these? We've already talked about how artificially it moves, but let's talk about controls. You can only use about 180 degrees of the analog stick to steer the snowboard. If you so much as tiptoe outside of that radius, Sonic will immediately stop moving. Trying to adjust his trajectory from there is torture. I gave the controller to my brother at one point and asked him to try playing, and the results were accurate to my first playthrough. The last of Sonic's alternate playstyles are his Mach speed sections. Because Sonic can no longer run fast, they decided to give Sonic sections where he moves at the speed of sound without being able to stop. If you hit anything, Sonic will spin around in midair whilst continuing to move, unable to allow the player any time to reorient themselves. If you jump, you cannot control Sonic in midair. If you decide to jump, you have to know what lies ahead. You have to commit to your landing, otherwise you'll be unable to save yourself from a mistake. I don't dislike the notion of not being able to stop running. It invites a new kind of danger to the fast-paced platforming, and I believe it served as a precursor to Sonic's next style of gameplay. It's just that it gives the player little control, little time to acclimate, and little room for error, transforming the potential for genuine challenge into unnecessary frustration. As for the other characters, Tails is slower than Sonic and his flight controls are nowhere near as satisfying as Sonic Adventure. He doesn't attack with his tails, instead throwing dummy ring bombs at enemies. It's an awkward attack, and if you get hit for some reason, you'll have to scramble to find which of the rings on the ground are actually real. Tails sucks. Knuckles and Rouge have you exploring your surroundings like the Sonic Adventure games before you can proceed as Sonic or Shadow. Knuckles' punches don't register half of the time, Rouge's attack has her pausing to throw bombs like Tails, and both of them are much slower than they should be. They suck. Shadow, unfortunately, is even more combat-centric. forcing you to mash the A button to kill enemies in a combo over and over again, but you can use his meter to throw Chaos Spears and even perform a dinky version of Chaos Blast, if you want to clear out groups of enemies. This is fine, but the heavy focus on combat slows the game to a crawl, and his vehicles don't add anything of worth to the game as a whole. Shadow kinda sucks. Amy sucks because her platforming and combat are painfully slow and boring, even more so than Sonic Adventure. Omega sucks for the same reasons, although it is fun to break levels in half with him. Silver, sadly, was a huge disappointment. The concept of physics-based telekinesis was something that fascinated me, as I loved playing with the gravity gun in Half-Life 2. Sadly, most of his stages are these slow, basic platforming sections, with the same combat loop of freezing missiles in midair and throwing nearby boxes at enemies. There was this section in Kingdom Valley where you have to throw a box at a faraway platform so that you can cross, which made me wonder about what might have been. What if they had some clever physics puzzles akin to Half-Life 2 that involved Silver's telekinesis? If his campaign had more substance, I feel like it would have been a nice change of pace, even if he was vastly